Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jenn, and I'm here with a guest who I'm so excited to talk to. I have followed her career for a very long time, and I'm so excited about this book. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yes, my name is Aisha Harris. I am a co-host of NPR's Pop Culture Happy Hour and the author of Wannabe, Reckonings with the Pop Culture That Shapes Me.
This book was so much fun, and it was such a delight to, follow you from the show to this book and see the ways in which like your thinking is expanded here, about the things that you talk about. And before we get into the book itself too much, I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that career and your journey toward this book. And maybe in particular, your journey from being a fan to a critic. And if that is like, are those two distinct things, or do you see a third boundary there too?
For sure. So I've been a professional critic, cultural critic for a little over a decade now. I started at Slate magazine, and I was there for a few years as a culture writer and editor, and also a podcast host of a previous show, one that I created called Represent, and that was a film and TV podcast focused on talking about film and TV from the perspectives of anyone who wasn't a straight cis white guy, basically. So women, people of color, queer people, disability, like we covered everything there. And after a few years at Slate, I wound up at the New York Times as an editor and a writer on the arts desk and on the opinion desk. And then I came to NPR a few years ago. I'm almost 3 years now. It's crazy to think about. I had been a huge fan of Pop Culture Happy Hour since its earliest days. I'd been listening to it when I was, in grad school. So I was very excited when I got the opportunity to work with people who I had admired for so long. And what I love about Pop Culture Happy Hour and what I've been able to do over these last few years is to really meld my love of pop culture with actually using it for critical purposes and being able to make a living off of it, which is hard to believe. So I count myself very lucky in that regards. But it's really to your question about sort of where the line is between being a fan versus being a critic. I think it all really depends on what it is I am facing when it comes to what I'm covering in pop culture. And I make no bone, like I don't try to cover up if I'm a fan of something. I think part of what's fun about this profession is that you can really champion the things that you love and do so kind of unabashedly. And you can also sort of be able to express maybe disappointment if you are a fan of someone or something, and then they put out something that doesn't quite connect with you in the way their previous work has. And I think acknowledging that, whether it's in a review or in our show, is something that people are able to relate to, in part because we all are fans of something, right? And I think it's important to acknowledge those the non-subjectivity that comes with being a critic.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and I think like acknowledging your status as a fan, if you are reviewing something that you do enjoy, can, I think, like it reminds me of, I guess this might be like a weird parallel, but I like escaped academia to come to libraries, and it reminds me of the ways in which like scholarship has become a lot more concerned with like the identity of the scholar, and how that affects what they see and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that like acknowledging that subjectivity is really useful for criticism. So to use that to transition to the book, which is, it's just so lovely. Like I loved every single essay, and I learned so much about the pop culture that I had already consumed, and also so many new properties to sort of explore and find out about. And I'm wondering, because obviously from the book you get that your experience is just immense in terms of what you have experienced in entertainment. And I'm wondering how you narrow down your subjects. Like how do you pick just a little bit to focus on when you have all of this stuff at your disposal?
Yeah, well, it's part critical exercise, but it's also part memoir. And so this book is really about me sort of exploring all the pop culture that I've consumed and how it's affected me at different points in my life, from being, a 4 or 5 year old, very impressionable child to the present day, where I'm still sort of wrestling with the things of my past and also wrestling with the things that are new and exciting out there. And so for me, it was really about trying to find those sort of pivotal moments in my life that coincided with something pop culture related, which is a lot of moments. And so, I'm talking in the first essay, I discuss my name and the way it has really it's really helped shape my view of myself and also myself as a Black woman, and how the way other people interpret my name or respond to my name really affected my self-esteem, and was also tied to popular culture because my name is, well, for one thing, it's a very popular name. A lot of people have it, but it's also the name of a song from the 90s that a lot of people of a certain age, if they encounter me, they will sing it at me. It's called Aisha from Another Bad Creation. It was a top 10 hit in the 90s. But then, I kind of wrestle with the fact that I didn't like that was a song that people associated with my name. And it really led me down this rabbit hole of like, okay, what does that mean? And why am I resisting this? And I think what I hope people are able to get from the book is sort of all of these little rabbit holes, how the pop culture that we consume, whether we know it or not, is very much always working on us in some way and affecting how we see ourselves and also how we see other people. And so that was sort of my overarching theme, and how I decided to choose sort of what to talk about and how. So yeah, it's been very interesting to sort of see how that evolved, because there actually, like, originally I had two essays based around friendship, and one of them I decided to actually, it wasn't quite working, or I didn't feel like I was saying much new, in terms of like how hard it is to be in your 30s and make friends. It's like, yeah, we've covered this territory before. So I wound up scrapping that one, but kept in one that was more about my experience as the Black friend, in predominantly white or non-Black spaces. And I used sort of the Black friend trope that has existed in film and TV and books for decades now, as a way of like relating that to my own identity. And really, like, when I was growing up in the 90s, that was a huge, Black friends were everywhere,
Mhm.
It's like kind of a replacement for the Black maid or servant in a way. And they're still everywhere. I mean, I think Emily in Paris has one. So it's something that still exists, but it's cool to think about how they've evolved to some extent, and also how I've related to that from a very personal level.
Hmm. Yeah, that is so interesting. And so first off, the first essay is my favorite. It's absolutely beautiful. And the way that it combines not only so many different pop culture references, but memory and other people's memories. And it's lovely.
Thank
And
you.
you're welcome. And yeah, to talk about the second essay you're talking about the Black friend, like I remember there was a period where I was going through for a blog that doesn't exist anymore, medieval movies, like things that took place in the Middle Ages. And I eventually got to Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and I was really like struck by the Morgan Freeman character, because they even put that character like in a medieval like text where where there were so many other interesting opportunities where you could use that representation, because it was like portraying a very global society that was that people moved in very freely, but then to just only use that to have a character who is like the one who listens to the white protagonist sort of talk about their dreams and stuff like that. It seems like such a wasted opportunity. And of course it was the 90s, and I'm looking at it from 2023, but it was very eye-opening for me to even like to read your essay and then think about that movie again, and have it like really just change the way that I've seen things that I've already experienced in the past. What I also love too, I'm sorry, is the way that you revisit certain properties throughout your life and look at the way that your opinions or your views of them have changed or what you get out of them. And I was wondering, do you find that useful not only personally, like thinking about how these things have shaped you, but also as a critic to see how your maybe your tastes and also the way that you view the medium has changed, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I love doing that. And I think there's a reductive version of like looking at things from the past and being like, this was problematic, where it's just like, this is problematic, how dare they, and we must like get rid of this, or like, why are we still talking about this thing? I think that can be very reductive, but I do think it's cool, and I think it's also important to kind of look back, because the thing is like we always talk about how like, or we like to excuse certain things where it's like, oh, well, it was this time, so things weren't as progressive then. And we keep doing that. And like, we're like, okay, so this movie in the 60s, oh my goodness, of course. But then like the same stuff will show up in something in the 90s, like, well, it was also that time. And then like in 20 years, we're going to be looking back and saying things now are problematic. And I just wonder, like, where do we draw the line? Like, when should we have all, and by we, I mean like, anyone who's not in a specific marginalized group or whatever, when should we have known better? and I think like what I like to think about is like how we can sort of reshape how we talk about those properties, and make it less about like, oh, well, those were different times, and more about just like, okay, but like what was happening, and then how is that being repeated now, or how is that really shifted now? And so something like I'm actually I'm watching for the first time Ally McBeal, just because I was just like, I've never watched this. It was on when I was a kid, but I knew about the dancing baby, but that was about it. And so I'm watching it now, and my goodness, so much of it is still relevant today, and a lot of it is very cringe, especially how they talk about fatness and weight, and it's just very kind of cringeworthy. But I also don't want to just be like, this is horrible, because I think it's really interesting to see how I don't think certain aspects of it would necessarily show up in as blatantly in pop culture today, but it still shows up, and we still haven't necessarily learned for all those things, especially when you have someone like Lizzo, who is constantly being attacked for being a fat Black woman. So I think like I really like being able to sort of take those things from the past and analyze them for what they were, but also analyze them for how they might still show up in the world in other ways. Because I think like progress is not linear. It's cyclical, right? So I just think it's really fun to be able to do that, and I'm glad I was able to do that a little bit in this book, because that is such an important skill, I think, to have when criticizing pop culture of the past.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when you are looking at things from before now, there is a very fine line between like putting something in its context and like making excuses for it, or, like something like that. And so it speaks to, I think, another essay where you talk about how difficult it is for both Black artists and Black critics to talk about their art without all of the expectations that come with, representation from communities that don't get to make a lot of very mainstream art. Could you talk a little bit about that essay, and, the what we might call like the weight of representation, and how characters often aren't allowed to just be themselves, but have to really stand for a lot, when you're talking about marginalized narratives.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this has been the conundrum for forever when it comes to being a Black artist, of wanting to both have the freedom to create art however you want to, but also feeling perhaps hemmed in or sort of boxed in to representing your entire ethnicity or race, and how that comes through in your work. And what I wanted to sort of uh, question in this piece was, this idea that in 2022, 23, whether we need, like, have we shifted our metrics and the way we talk about Black art, um in like along with the way that Black art has shifted, as a movement and as an experience. I think that we live in very different times. I mean, there are still, look, Hollywood still has tons and tons of issues with equity and fairness when it comes to representation on screen. There's still a lot of things that are created by Black artists and by non-white art or non-Black artists that I think are not necessarily great for when we're talking about progress and how Black people are represented on screen. But I think overwhelmingly, we live in an unprecedented time where we have so many Black creators who are able to create really interesting and fascinating things in the mainstream. And so I don't think we necessarily need to uh, treat it like it's this fragile thing. And when as a Black critic, I've definitely gotten a lot of pushback for certain critiques I've made of Black films and TV shows. um, One of them is The Little Mermaid, which is the new Little Mermaid, and the starring Halle Bailey as a Black Ariel, where I've been accused of being anti-Black for not liking the movie, thinking it's not good, or not supporting the movie, and this idea that, like, well, if you don't support this movie, then they're not going to make more of these things. And I'm like, well, that's not true. This isn't 1975. This isn't 1965. I think that to treat Black art as though it's like we need to treat everything with kids' gloves, I think is a real disservice to it. And I want us to be able to not be afraid to critique it, and feel the way we do about it, even if we don't like it. And I also want to point people to all of the other underrepresented or not well-known Black filmmakers who are making things. They may not be on the level of Jordan Peele or Ryan Coogler, but they exist. And one of my favorite movies of last year was a horror movie called Nanny, and directed by Nikyatu Jusu. And it was a kind of a smaller film. I think it's streaming on Amazon, or it was, but I want to point people to those types of movies because they do exist. You just have to look for them. So that's kind of the crux of that essay, is me sort of wrestling with, okay, how do we talk about Black art when Black art has never been, I think, never had more opportunity to shine in the way that it does, and how we should kind of adjust our critiques accordingly.
To kind of connect two essays, do you think this is a bigger issue, like when the representation we're talking about is happening in IP, which you also talk about, because these are these are movies that have like the budget of like a small nation,
Yeah. Yes.
writing on them, and not only that, but like, I haven't even seen The Little Mermaid yet, but I've read it's been debated on Twitter, on TikTok, everywhere for so many months that like it almost doesn't, regardless of what you think about it, it never had a chance to exist as a work of art on its own before being
Yeah.
with all of this discourse, so
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And the thing about it is like, this is a Disney property. Disney owns half of the entertainment industry at this point. So like trying to support Disney, this giant conglomerate like media company, near monopoly, and saying that like if you talk bad about this movie, you're letting either A, you're letting the racists win because there's a huge backlash about Ariel being black. I just think it's like really silly and thoughtless. And I want better for kids and also for their parents who have to go see those movies. Like, I think for me, when I think about and I kind of break down sort of the exceptions to the rules of IP and when it works and when it doesn't, and when reboots and sequels work and when it doesn't. And I think my biggest issue with what Disney is doing now is the fact that like it's taking these old properties and trying to retrofit them and get like brownie points for casting a black princess or including, like various ethnicities in roles that were previously cast as white. I think when it's at its best, it's creating new properties that star those types of characters, whether it's Moana or Coco, or Coco's Pixar, but like under the Disney umbrella. Those are, I think that's where it shines. And I think that, casting a black James Bond, sure, okay. But like I'd much rather get like a new, its own our own sort of like international spy assassin guy who's like not based off of a pre-existing character. To me, that is more progress than just like turning everything into the Wiz. And I like the Wiz, but like
Yeah.
come on.
I think your point about James Bond is particularly apt. And I remember reading a lot of interesting things about that on Twitter too, is that like, it would be better in a lot of ways to make a new character than rather to sort of like, I don't know, like keep resurrecting like an extraordinarily like, colonial and problematic character. Like that won't be, like
Yeah.
there are just like better opportunities. It reminds me of something that kind of was happening in the publishing world too, like where these old publishers are bringing back like, Roald Dahl, and they're republishing his stuff, but they're taking out the words that like don't really quite fly anymore and stuff like that. It's like
Yeah.
you could do that, but you could also just publish new people, and like they
Yeah.
actually speak to kids today, because how many children today, like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. It just, I see it happening across multiple fields, and it just seems like it's all part of the same conversation.
Yeah. Well, publish new people or like publish it as it was written with like some sort of disclaimer or guidance for kids, like a foreword or something, or, like an annotated version. I don't know. But like, I don't, TCM, Turner Classic Movies, has done something similar with, especially with its screening of Gone with the Wind, where like anytime they show it now, they always include either in the beginning or the end or both, like the intros that they have with the hosts talking about how racist it is. And I think to me that's the better solution, as opposed to just trying to edit or completely censor these films or books or TV shows or whatever. Like acknowledge that it's there, and then also like acknowledge why it's wrong or problematic, if that's the word you want to use.
That is super interesting. Yeah, because I think that changing these old texts or films also kind of denies them their status as like also a historical text, because it's also a
Exactly.
window into
Yeah.
the time. And if you keep updating it and never leave it alone, like it never really gets to represent anything. Like if it has to speak to everything at all times. Um, so thank you so much for joining us. This has been really great. And I'm wondering, do you plan to ever publish any more essays or write any more books? Do you think this will happen again?
I'm sure my editor wants me to say yes. I definitely, one of the things I loved about this was that as a writer who always writes too much, it was nice to have a larger playground, sandbox, whatever you want to call it, to be able to write very, very long. And so I definitely want to be able to keep exploring longer form essays, because this was just like so much fun, and I got to really, really nerd out a lot. This book is not just like it's critical and it's what it's personal, but it's also very heavily researched. I have a lot of footnotes, and I use a lot of JSTOR and and LexisNexis to like dig into the archives, and it was really fun to do that. So I will say never say never.
Well, it's great to hear. I would love to read more. And I hope that if you do publish more, you'll consider coming back to the show because it was great to talk about this book.
I would love that. Thanks so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Okay, listeners, please check out Wannabe, Reckonings with the Pop Culture That Shaped Me. When you hear this, it will be available, so please check it out at your favorite bookstore or library. Thank you so much for joining us, and it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.